Let's start off with this. Interviews to select the next National Prosecuting Authority head continue despite the DA's threats to interdict the process. Newzroom Afrika's Zoleka Qodashe attended today's interviews and joins us live from Pretoria. Zoleka, very good evening to you. Quite a long day for those that are wanting to be the next NPA chief, and I can imagine that tomorrow will be just as long and as grueling.
That's correct, Katlego. Good evening, and good evening to the viewers. Well, quite a long day for the candidates, but equally so for the media that's had to sit through the marathon proceedings that began around 10 a.m., just after 10 a.m. this morning, and only concluded just now with the third candidate. That's the head of the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption, Advocate Andrea Johnson. And those interviews were essentially trying to extract as much information from the candidates in relation to what they can add, the value that they can add towards the National Prosecuting Authority. So this morning we started with the DPP in the province of the Western Cape, that's Advocate Nicolette Baum, that spoke about some of her interventions in relation to the National Prosecuting Authority, particularly in the Western Cape. But a concern for the commissioners, or rather for the advisory panel, was whether they were able to expand some of their interventions in the Western Cape to the rest of the country, given the fact that the Western Cape faces a variety of challenges, gang violence, you see sexual offences as well. And a particular concern for the advisory panel was, and particularly the chairperson of the panel, that's the Justice and Constitutional Development Minister, Mameloko Gobai, was essentially the low conviction rates in relation to serious crimes and how the Western Cape performs in relation to that. And because of this, there is a fear from the panel that this will not then be confined just to the Western Cape, and instead will spread across the country should any of the candidates that are in the Western Cape or currently based in the Western Cape were to be appointed as the National Director for Public Prosecutions, because that role would essentially entail that they have the wider scope in terms of their handling of work within the NPA. And so that was a particular concern for the advisory panel. But there was also another concern in relation to their contribution towards the NPA at a national level. Now, it was Advocate Bell's submission that essentially she feels that corruption is one of the issues that continue to rob South Africa, particularly the youth, of various opportunities. And then she says that the NPA must work towards fighting crime, and specifically looked at the IDAC and the work that it does to combat crime. But there was also a concern around another candidate, that is Advocate Adrian Mop, who is the Deputy Director for Public Prosecutions also in the Western Cape. So in terms of seniority, he reports to Advocate Nicolette Bell. And so those two names emanated or came from the Western Cape in relation to this post for the top job of the NPA in the country. And so both of them appeared for interviews, but there was also concern around how that came to be. Let's take a listen to what some of the commissioners believed may have been the conversations that took place around the nomination of candidates within the Western Cape.
Both the candidate, Advocate Mop, and myself were nominated by senior management.
Two more, actually. The people who nominated you actually also got nominated from your office.
Indeed, indeed, Minister. We were concerned as to the candidate, Mr. Mop, and I, as to we didn't want rivalry in the office. But because of the team that we had built, the leadership that our leadership team was fine. When I took office, was fairly new. It was transferring skills, developing, and encouraging them that we need different views, whether you're matured, older, whether you're new in the province as well. So the management team have found their voices and they're very strong about it. And I was reminded that, and this is what I tell prosecutors as well, we are in service. Servant leadership, that is what we do.
Now, Qodashe, that was just one of the incidents in which the advisory panel raised concerns around two of the candidates that applied and vying for the top post in the National Prosecuting Authority. But there was also a concern that was raised by Advocate Adrian Mop in relation to the way that the NPA has handled several issues, particularly those in relation to state capture. And he essentially raised the concern that these were never addressed and that those that may have been found wanting within the National Prosecuting Authority were never brought to book and never sought explanations from, or that the head of the NPA, the incumbent, that's Advocate Shamila Batoy, did not seek explanations from, and that explanation was not sought, and that raised a concern, particularly for Advocate Mop. But there were also questions around his prosecutorial abilities within the NPA. Now, you'll remember that Advocate Adrian Mop was one of the lead investigators in the Dewani case that happened several years ago, where the couple, Annie Dewani, as well as her husband, flew in from the United Kingdom into South Africa, and there was that alleged robbery that had gone wrong in which Annie Dewani was then brutally murdered. And so there were several findings by the judge in that matter, particularly in relation to the witnesses that were brought forth by the NPA in relation to specifically Advocate Adrian Mop and what he was able to present before the court. And you remember that that led to the acquittal in that particular matter. He still stands by the witnesses that he brought before the court, saying that they acted within the best of their ability in seeking to secure a conviction in that matter. But there were also questions around Jocelyn Smith. You'll remember the little girl that went missing, and in a court matter that spanned several months in the Western Cape. And particularly this question was for the head of the NPA in the province, that's Advocate Nicolette Bell, in relation to how that matter was handled. And you'll remember that there were search teams comprising of community members that went out into communities and interviewing people seeking to find this little girl who is still missing to this date. Of course, there was a positive a conviction in that matter, but the manner in which it was handled raised concerns for the advisory panel. And so it was the submission of Advocate Bell that she also feared for what was taking place at that particular moment, and there was also a cause for concern for her, given the fact that everyone, she says, had become a detective in that particular matter. But the last candidates, that's Advocate Andrea Johnson, the head of IDAC, has faced several questions, particularly at the very beginning of her interview before the advisory panel that's looking to fill this very important position within the NPA. And that's in relation to her position as a member of a union. Now, it was the chairperson of the advisory panel, that's the Justice and Constitutional Development Minister, Mameloko Kubai, that raised questions around this dual kind of membership that she holds within a union, but also as a senior member within IDAC and how that was allowed to happen. Let's take a listen to this interaction.
Didn't you get curious, having signed the form at one point, about the fact that there is this relationship that you have with this body that actually appears before you as a chairperson in a hearing, and you are a manager, senior manager in the space? Didn't it occur to you, at least for you to be a little curious?
I haven't been, and I know that it's
Sorry about that.
sorry. I do not want
this to seem as though it's a glib answer. It isn't a glib answer. It didn't occur to me because I was just doing what was within the mandate and what was expected of me. I chaired the disciplinary knowing that I had to be objective on all fronts. Who appears should not be relevant. It is the evidence that is placed before you. That is all that I could and did adjudicate on. If you start to wonder about parties, you make yourself prejudiced and biased to the process and should therefore recuse yourself.
Now, Qodashe, it was the evidence of Advocate Andrea Johnson that essentially she was not an active participant in this union and that she still received or was having her salary deducted from her membership in the union. And it was a question that was raised by, or a point that was made by the panel members that essentially that is neither here nor there. The fact that she does not actively participate in the workings of the union, but instead the fact that she still occupies a position in the union raises serious concerns and also questions about her ability to for foresight and to recuse herself in matters where it matters the most. In fact, just before we concluded proceedings today, there were questions that were posed around her recusal in a matter in around 2007. You remember that this was also something that was tackled before the ad hoc committee in Parliament around how she participated in a process that essentially led to the appointment of her husband at the DSO. And so she provided the same explanation that she recused herself from the process insofar as her husband would be interviewed at a particular time, but did not recuse herself from the entire process, meaning that she participated in other interviews in which other candidates would have been interviewed, but recused herself only when it was her husband that was being interviewed. Another point that was raised by the minister is that essentially that rendered that entire process, the process in its entirety, irregular because she participated and the panel that essentially conducted the interviews is not the panel that came to the conclusion of who to hire. And so that particular issue, she says, was oversight on her part as well, offering the same explanation that she offered before the Parliamentary Ad Hoc Committee. But there was also a question about her CV and how she chose to hand it in or submit it before this advisory panel. And essentially, looking at the referees that she, or the references that she has placed within the CV, and one of them is the suspended head of legal in Ekurhuleni, that is Kemi Bahari, who was essentially fingered in the Commission of Inquiry that's investigating allegations of criminal infiltration and political interference in the criminal justice system, and how essentially she used that person as a reference in her CV, and also said that that took place prior to when he was suspended. You remember that Buhari was fingered as having shielded Julius Mkhwanazi from accountability within the EMPD. So something that was also a major concern for the advisory panel. Let's take a listen.
The suspension happened after the nomination and CV submission, but I did tell him I have to remove him, and we also agreed that given the allegations that are made, given the fact that he is suspended, although we hadn't talked for months, we will not be able to talk at all till his issues are resolved. I did stand in judgment. I might lose much more friends because I am judgmental, but I had to do that because in the seat that I'm sitting in today for this position, the perceptions do matter, and I've had to do that.
Prof, you want to say something?
As the head of IDEC, I'll assume that your first instinct is vigilance and
Correct.
verification.
Correct?
And it does look like in some instances you allow for this profound blind spot. Because let me escort my logic
Sure.
When you are to put someone for reference, the common practice is to go back to them and talk to them to say, I have applied for A, and now I have applied for B, I have applied for C. There is no retainer in reference where you say, you will always be there.
Understood.
So it would look like you have not spoken with the person for months, but you were able to utilize their reference as such.
All right, Zoleka, so that then ends today's proceedings with regards to that first leg of interviews. Tomorrow we are expecting to see the former NDPP Menza Similani together with the former investigating directorate head Hermione Cronje, as well as advocate Qodashe Kanyile, who will then be also facing those questions and their interviews taking place. So thank you so much for your time, Zoleka. We certainly do hope that you'll be bringing us more updates tomorrow as those interview processes continue.